you got back to these debates about, are the politicians raiding the trust fund? Are they funding the rest of the government through Social Security?
Yeah,
And
right. Yeah, right. I mean, we saw, as I wrote about in the first paper, you had all of these debates in the 1930s about what to do with this big trust fund. And the original idea was that you would pay down the national debt. Now, what happened, of course, in the 80s and the 90s is we again had the big trust fund. And the argument was, well, if we're going to use this money to pay down the debt, or as former Senator Patrick Moynihan from New York wanted to do, he said, look, if you're not going to use the money to pay down the debt, just give it back. Just cut the payroll tax, give the money back to people. And in the future, when we need the money to pay for the baby boomers and the demographic changes, we'll just raise the payroll tax in the future. Of course, nobody liked, well, a lot of people like the idea of cutting the payroll tax, but the notion of having to raise it again later was like, they didn't want to go along with that. So as a result, we just said, well, look, we're going to build up the trust fund and hopefully the money will go to pay down the debt. Now, as people recall, we didn't pay down the debt. The debt has been rising. Well, actually, there was a brief period from 98 to 2001 where the debt did go down a little bit. But essentially, for the past 40 years, we've been increasing the debt. So the argument that we're going to use the Social Security surplus to pay down the debt when the debt was rising, people didn't buy that. They said, look, you guys are just borrowing the money and spending it. It can't very well help us pay for the future benefits if you're spending the money and the debt's rising. And so, essentially, you had a big replay of the debt of the debate that we saw back in the 1930s. It was the same.
Well, there's kind of a self-validating argument that people make that the trust fund surplus actually does help pay future benefits, because even if the debt is rising, whether the debt is rising or falling, it substitutes for debt that the government would otherwise have incurred, and thus the economy, the nation is in a better fiscal position than it would be because of the Social Security surplus. So we shouldn't worry about it. You take on that argument pretty frontally, I would say, in this issue brief.
Yeah, no, the economists, they went from arguing we're going to pay down the debt and we're going to save all this money on interest and that's going to help us. But then when the debt kept rising, instead of saying we're paying down the debt, they're just saying, well, we're not paying it down. It's just, think how much bigger it would be if we didn't use the Social Security surplus. So it's sort of like, but when you start looking through that argument, you realize that it doesn't hold up to much scrutiny, because essentially, every time Congress would enact the earned income tax credit, or, the deduction for the self-employed, or the deduction or the tax credit for employers of tipped employees, we've reduced income taxes numerous times to offset the higher payroll taxes. So it's sort of hard to argue that the higher payroll taxes are paying down the debt when we're using higher payroll taxes as an excuse to cut income taxes. So, that again, the argument just doesn't hold up to scrutiny.